there's anything else to add, apart from the tea coffee here, and also Frank's got books for sale. So
if I speak like this, is that, can everybody hear?
Yes.
I don't want that.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
He starts going into songs, don't you? So he's there just in case.
If there's any requests.
Is there any requests? Yeah.
But not in Spinal Cord.
No, I don't want them. No. Shall I turn the main lights off?
Yes, please. Okay, we're ready?
Everyone's here now, yeah.
Okay, so thanks for everybody for turning up tonight, and thanks for Martin for inviting me again. So for those of you that have not seen this presentation before, I'm going to tell you a story of relatively modern but unknown history of which I'm a product of. And I was actually born less than a mile from here, just down the road in Horton Green. I now live near Stockport in a place called Mellor, and I've lived in Manchester all my life, apart from a couple of years at university and a few years where I worked abroad. But as I say, I'm a Mancunian through and through, but my surname is clearly not an English name. My dad came from Poland. I know he'd been in the British Army. I knew he'd been in an internment camp of some description during the war, but I knew very little else about his past, and he didn't want to talk about it. And sadly, it wasn't until he died, we had the advent of the internet and communism fell down, that I started to look at the reasons why he was in Manchester and why he hadn't gone home. So this is that story. And when I started to look, I found that there was lots of people with similar ambitions to what I'd got, to find out what had happened in their background to make them what they were. And this group was one of the first groups I came across. It's called the Kresy-Siberia group. And I'll explain why that name is important as we go through the talk. And I'm really indebted to them, to the early sort of phases of my research. And the map, oh not the map, but the actual symbol shows the sort of the badge of Poland broken in 2/3 like that. And you'll see as we go through the story what the symbolism and the meaning is behind that. Anyway, it's not just about a description of my dad's journey from Poland to Manchester. It's a significant chapter in the whole of the Polish history. And it includes most of Poland. And what's bizarre is that the intrigue that sits behind it still continues to this day. And it's a huge, huge subject. It's largely unknown, and it's still surrounded in mystery and intrigue, so it includes things like war, murder, conspiracy, conjecture, and ultimately betrayal. You'd think, though, it would have a nice, clear beginning, a very convoluted middle, and a convenient end, but sadly that's not the case, and I'll try and explain. So, Poland, as we know it, has existed for quite some time. There are records of the tribes going back to the 15th century BC in that central area of Poland, but the documented history of Poland didn't actually start till about the 10th century AD, when a tribe called the Poloni, where we get the name Poland from, started to sort of combine all the tribes in Central Europe around what we now know as Poznan. And this is a famous Polish painting by this Jan Matejko, and it's the start of Christianity in Poland just before the turn of the 1000th century. Poland, though, was at times a huge, huge and powerful country in Central Europe. But its problem was that it was in Central Europe, and it was situated between the superpowers of those of the West that ultimately became Germany, and those to the East, which obviously was Russia and the Soviet Union. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that existed by 1619 actually controlled about 1/3 of Europe's landmass. So a huge, huge country with rich culture, a strong educational system, and the beginnings of a sort of democracy. So it is a very well developed country. But as I said, the problem was it sat right in the middle of these vast superpowers. So every time they had a bit of a spat, Poland got trampled on. And hopefully there's a bit of a video now as we lead through. So from 1619, as I said, it was a massive country at the centre of Europe. But as the years moved on, you can see it gets pummeled from the left and from the right, from the east, from the west, from the south, from the north, and it changes and changes its size and its power base. So much so that by the end of the 18th century, it actually gets partitioned several times. And by 1795, you can see it disappears completely. It's engulfed in the part of imperialistic Russia, and some of it into the west, what became the Austrian and eventually the Austro-Hungarian, and then when Germany was formed, the German empires to the west. And by the beginning of the First World War, which we'll get to in a minute, by the beginning of the First World War, it had gone completely. Poland didn't exist. So it hadn't existed for over 120 years at this point. And my dad's village is about 100 kilometres to the east of the city he knew as Vilno. We know it today as the capital of Lithuania and Vilnius, but his village was about 100 kilometres to the east, a little village called Shvaksty, right in the middle of the Russian Empire. And as we know, in the August of 1914, the First World War was declared. Russia were quick off the mark and they invaded to the west into the German area. And the ethnic Poles in this area would fight for whichever side they thought would give them the best chance of independence after the war. So you got those Poles that would fight with the Germans, the Polish legions, and then you get those like my grandfather who fought with the Russians against the Germans. So as I say, at the beginning of the First World War, the border was here. So this to the east of this line was the Russian Empire, and they immediately attacked, but they were absolutely devastated. First at the Battle of, I can't read it here, but I think that says Tannenberg. So at the Battle of Tannenberg, then a few months later at two battles of the Masurian Lakes, and the the German and the Austro-Hungarians pushed east all along this line, and what we got then was the Russian Great Retreat of 1915. And by the end of 1915, the border existed from Riga in the north, in Latvia, all the way down to, at that time, neutral Romania in the south. And my dad's village was in this little salient that stuck out right on the front line. And in the March of 1916, there was a huge, huge battle. Most of us have never heard of it. It's called the Battle of Lake Naroch in March 1916. It was hugely significant. The Germans were vastly outnumbered 4-1 by the Russian armies. But they were decimated in quite a brutal fashion. So my grandfather, as I said, fought for the Russians, not in this battle. He fought further north on the what is now called the Daugava River, or in those days it was called the Dvinsk, the Dvina River, and he was injured quite badly up there, and he was actually sent to recuperate in what at the time was known as, well, it's now called St. Petersburg. Does anybody know what it might have been called at the time he went? Well, I'm talking about 1918, 19. Does anybody know what it might have been called? That's far too clever. No, it became Leningrad, but somebody said it out of the back. I was expecting everybody to say Leningrad, but somebody beat me to it. At that time it was called Petrograd. St. Petersburg, as we now know it, was formed in 1703 as St. Petersburg, but in 1914, because it sounded too Germanic and they were at war with the Germans, they renamed it to Petrograd. So my grandfather went to Petrograd, where my father was born in 1920. Then in 1924 it became Leningrad, and then it was